In the right situations, Cyrus can guarantee you the win. In fact, I think it's better than Sabrina. The only problem is it has restrictions on how it's used. Welcome back to another TCG Pocket video, it's Brovini here. Today we're doing a deep dive on this card. We're going to cover its mechanics and then we're going to cover what types of decks would be ideal for its use. Should I use it in every single deck, kind of like Sabrina? Before Cyrus's release, I used Sabrina in almost every single deck. We're also going to briefly cover the types of cards that work well with Cyrus. Firstly, what you need to know about its mechanics. So this is how Cyrus works. Switch in one of your opponent's benched Pokemon that has damage on it to the active spot. In contrast, Sabrina says switch out your opponent's active Pokemon to the bench. Your opponent chooses the new active Pokemon. So I didn't personally realize this, but when the game tells you that your opponent chooses the new Pokemon, your opponent chooses. But if the game doesn't say that your opponent chooses the Pokemon, like in Cyrus's case, as it turns out, the person who uses this card, so you, the player, actually chooses which Pokemon gets switched in. Of course, if there's only one damaged Pokemon on the bench, then there wouldn't be much of a choice at all. But if there are multiple damaged Pokemon, you actually get that choice. Whereas in Sabrina's case, if your opponent has laid down several benched Pokemon and to win the game, you actually need them to switch in the one you want them to switch in, well, you don't get that choice. In fact, if your opponent is smart, they wouldn't give you the win. In Cyrus's case, they don't have that choice because you get to choose the Pokemon to switch in. So having that choice already makes Cyrus better than Sabrina. The only catch is, well, you can't use Cyrus if you haven't damaged the opponent's benched Pokemon, or if they haven't switched out their active Pokemon which has damage on it into their bench. In fact, you don't even have the option to use Cyrus if the opponent's bench doesn't have any damaged Pokemon. So some setting up is required, or as just part of the process of you beating your opponent, you're going to need to do some damage so that you force the active Pokemon to retreat. Using the same example, I just damaged the bench Pokemon using Blizzard from Articuno, which does 10 damage to each of the bench Pokemon, leaving this Rapidash with 10 less HP. And now if I use Cyrus, well, the game tells me I have a choice of which Pokemon to switch in, but of course because the Rapidash is the only one that has damage on it, it'll be the target for Cyrus. Of course, in this case, it didn't really matter whether I used Cyrus or not, I would have won the game anyway. But in situations where to win the game you need to defeat a specific target in your opponent's bench, then Cyrus will be better than Sabrina as long as the bench has been damaged. So the natural next question to ask is, which Pokemon or which strategy can be best used with Cyrus? I already showed you one example, and that's Articuno, because Articuno can damage all of your opponent's bench, after which you can choose any of the Pokemon from the bench to bring out with Cyrus. Now in terms of the cards that work well with Cyrus, I've placed them into several groups. The first group are Pokemon that can hit both the active Pokemon and all of the bench Pokemon. So Articuno was one, another is Palkia because Palkia EX does 20 damage to each of the bench Pokemon, after which you can use Cyrus to bring out any of them that you like. Steve's existence and also Manaphy's existence, I think energy cost isn't as big a deal. You could also try Raichu from Mythical Island, which only requires one evolution, but it still needs 3 energy. And you could use Lieutenant Surge to help it gain its energy. But it doesn't do as much damage to the active Pokemon as Articuno EX or Palkia EX. And the last one that I found that fits into this category is Spiritomb. Spiritomb is a real interesting one. It has a decent HP for a basic Pokemon that's not EX. It only needs 1 retreat cost, and its attack only requires 1 energy. This attack does 10 damage to all of your opponent's Pokemon, including the active and all of the benched Pokemon. It's also a colorless energy, meaning that, well, you could use this in any deck. You don't have to just use it in darkness decks. Using Spiritomb's attack just one time on your opponent's team will allow you to use Cyrus in any way you want in the turn after, as long as it survives the next hit. If you've got a big damage dealer in your bench ready to go, you would swap Spiritomb out in the next turn and Cyrus to choose whichever Pokemon you want to bring out to the bench from your opponent, and then hit it with your main damage dealer. And I'm hoping you will win the game. Of course, there are ways to counter this play. Your opponent could use Potion or Erica if they anticipate you using Cyrus. And another counterplay is using Shadow Void ability of Dusknoir, because you can actually move all the damage that your team has taken to Dusknoir. Meaning that if your opponent uses Cyrus, then the only Pokemon to be switched in would be Dusknoir. If I miss any Pokemon that do similar things as these guys, let me know in the comments section below. For the second group, these are the Pokemon that do damage to the active Pokemon and one bench Pokemon, so a single target plus the active. We are seeing yet another water type in this video. So Frost Rotom can do 10 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. Doesn't seem like much, but if you combine it with Cyrus, maybe in the next turn you can do some serious damage. Empoleon is another option, but 3 energy and a 2-stage evolution, so it'll take a bit longer in order to get this working. But because it still does a significant damage with 80 damage, you can just use Empoleon itself to finish off your opponent after you use Cyrus. So Empoleon can double as both the damage dealer and also the chip damage on the bench Pokemon. And yet another water type, Gastrodon, 60 damage and 20 damage on your opponent's bench Pokemon. And there's Lopunny, who can do 20 damage to the active and 20 damage to the bench. I'm personally not seeing a lot of benefits of using Lopunny versus using Spiritomb. The damage increase isn't a lot more and it requires an evolution. The third group of Pokemon that you can use with Cyrus are the ones that hit a single target in the bench. One downside of this is that, well, you'll need another damage dealer ready to attack whoever you bring out with Cyrus afterwards. So Hitmonlee was one of the original Pokemon that can hit a single unit, single target in the bench. Lumineon requiring one evolution but does 50 damage to a bench Pokemon. One of the fan favorites, Greninja, does it but via its ability. 20 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon. It can be bench and it can also be active. Seadra, 50 damage to any one of your opponent's Pokemon. Zebstrika, Volcarona, which does a crazy 80 damage to any of your opponent's Pokemon, but at this point it's probably more of a damage dealer than it is a setup for Cyrus. With 80 damage and discarding 2 energy, I think Volcarona is here to finish off your opponent directly. This Electabuzz is interesting. You can do 40 damage to any one of your opponent's Pokemon. Then you can use Cyrus to bring them out, evolve the Electabuzz, and do an additional either 40 or 120 damage to that opponent. So in a way, also acting as a damage dealer. If you think about it, whatever Pokemon Cyrus has brought out has already suffered 40 damage, and if you do 120, that's 160 damage in total, of course requiring 4 energy attached. But that's enough to take out most EX Pokemon, without itself needing to be an EX. Luxray kind of falls into this group, but its use is probably not to set up Cyrus, more just to finish off the opponent, because 120 damage to any of your opponent's Pokemon and then discarding all of its energies, I think it's a very costly and probably just a finishing move, not a setup move. And I've seen this card being played in Lake Trio decks, doing 20 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon, so it could be a bench Pokemon, and then using Cyrus to finish him off with the Lake Trios. And this is another one that can do 50 damage to any one of your opponent's Pokemon. The fourth strategy to set up Cyrus is to switch out your opponent's damaged active Pokemon. So for example, you can use Graplock to do 70 damage to their active Pokemon, force them to switch out, and in the next turn bring them back with Cyrus. Pidgeot, so not the EX, can also do that if they've already got damage on the active Pokemon. Victreebel's ability can also achieve similar results. And in actual fact, Sabrina herself is also a setup for Cyrus, because it also forces your opponent to switch out. So if they've already got damage on their Pokemon, switch them out, damage the new active Pokemon, and then you can choose to bring them back with Cyrus in the next turn. You can actually combine Sabrina with Darkrai EX, whose ability can do damage to the active Pokemon, use Sabrina, swap them out, and then actually damage their active Pokemon using an attack, then decide whether you want to switch them back with Cyrus. I tried my best to incorporate every Pokemon that can work with Cyrus up to the release of Spacetime Smackdown, but if I missed any, let me know in the comments section below. But just because you use one of these Pokemon, does that mean you should always bring Cyrus? And how many Cyrus should you bring? Now, of course, due to the complex nature of this game, how many different types of decks you can build and how many different types of abilities and item cards and supported cards you can use in combination, all I can give you is general advice. My general advice is you should not use Cyrus if you don't do any low damage or chip damage at all. So for example, earlier I mentioned that Luxray and Volcarona do pretty big damage, and really they're aiming to finish off your opponents. Another one would be something like a Charizard EX deck that runs Moltres EX as well. There's not really any card in this type of deck to do chip or small amounts of damage. You're really just trying to finish your opponent off with Crimson Storm, which does 200 damage and almost nobody can survive that amount. You are not relying on switching your opponent in to win the game. Unless of course the goal is to get 2 points by forcing the EX Pokemon to switch in, then maybe you'll need to also run a Spiritomb at the same time in this deck to run Cyrus as well. Whether you have enough space in your deck to accommodate all of that, well, that's another question. But otherwise, a simple Moltres EX Charizard EX deck should not use Cyrus. On the other hand, if you manage to do a lot of damage to your opponent's bench Pokemon, for example, you got some early blizzards in, and you can rely on Cyrus to choose whichever Pokemon you want from their bench to come into the active spot, I think it's worth putting in 1 or even 2 Cyrus in this type of deck. But if your deck does damage somewhere in the low to mid range, or maybe you're running a Poison Stall deck, or maybe something like an Executor EX which does on average 60 damage per turn, where your opponent has the chance to switch out their active Pokemon after being damaged, then I think it's worthwhile to have at least 1 Cyrus in your deck to bring them back out. You can choose to bring that damaged Pokemon back out for you to finish it off. And don't forget that just because you run Cyrus doesn't mean you can't combine it with Sabrina as well. Heck, I sometimes even run 2 Sabrina and 2 Cyrus depending on what type of deck I've got. Let me know what you guys think about Cyrus and whether you think it should replace Sabrina or it should be combined with Sabrina, or maybe Sabrina is still the queen. Thank you for watching, guys. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Now in this part of the video, I just want to show you the example I used in the earlier parts of the video, which actually made really good use of Cyrus. In fact, for the most part of this battle, I thought I was going to lose, but 2 Cyrus came into play and helped me win. This was how we started. Pretty standard Moltres EX lead, building up the energy for the Charmander to evolve all the way to Charizard. I was lucky enough that they never got to Charizard, but Cyrus was able to pull out the Charmeleon and finish it off before they could evolve anyway. Over 2 turns, my opponent was able to gain 3 energies for their bench. My Misties were not even landing, and my opponent was very far ahead. In fact, they were already on 2 win points and had a total of 7 energies when I was only on 4. But this is where things turned around. Cyrus was able to pull out the Charmeleon that had 5 energies attached to it, so my opponent had put all their eggs in one basket hoping to evolve that Charmeleon, only to be destroyed by my Articuno EX. But at this stage I was still behind by 2 win points, so have a look at the Moltres that's still in the bench. 50 HP, they retreated that Moltres so that it wouldn't die and lose them 2 points, but guess what else is in my hand right now? It is Cyrus. No matter what they do at this point, I would have won this game. So they're trying to heal their Charmeleon, hoping to see Charizard, use their Moltres to gain more energies, but as you can see, Cyrus, well, 2 of them is what actually won me the game. And here is my second use of Cyrus, which had brought out their EX Pokemon that was heavily damaged already, giving me all the win points I needed. I never even had to face a Charizard.